Hi, Jonathan Hetterly here, and today on Psych Cinema, we're going to be exploring the psychology behind the cinematic trope of white savior films. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Now today's going to be a little bit different because we're going to look more at a cinematic trope rather than one singular film. But before we do that, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out anytime we drop new content that explores the rich intersection between psychology and pop culture. So why am I choosing now to talk about this cinematic trope of white savior films? Well, it's because it's actually in the pop culture landscape right now. The Oscar-nominated film Green Book has brought back the attention of white savior films where Viggo Mortensen is up for a Best Lead Actor nomination, and Mahershala Ali is up for a Best Supporting Actor as they play these real-life characters and the friendship that is created between the two of them. And there has been a lot of controversy surrounding this film, given that the family of the real-life character that Mahershala Ali portrays basically claims they were not consulted about this, that it is factually incorrect in terms of how they depict the relationship and friendship between the two characters in the film, or his relationship with his family. And this again has brought back these questions of these types of films where there's a white protagonist and a secondary or marginalized character of color. And what it speaks to us that these films seem to be so critically and commercially lauded, even though a lot of people find it to be problematic. So before we get started, let's just basically lay out the starting premises of what do I mean when I talk about white savior cinema. So white savior, when I mention that as a film trope, it's the confluence of practices, processes, and institutions that reify historical inequities to ultimately validate white privilege. So what it tends to involve is a big emotional experience that validates privilege. Oftentimes, people are rewarded for saving those less fortunate, and they're able to completely disregard the policies that have supported or created or maintained systems of oppression. And so why do some films have such problematic components of white savior? Well, there's a number of things that don't always translate just to what is on the screen. Because first and foremost, we want to look at the point of view and the creators. Now, there are a number of films I can throw out that really have elements of white savior cinema woven into its construction. Films as far back as To Kill a Mockingbird might be one, but even more recent ones like Glory, The Help, The Blind Side, Hidden Figures, or in this case, what's trending right now is Green Book. They all have elements where there is a white character that oftentimes they grow, or they learn, or they help others, those in need, and a lot of times the other characters of color, they're marginalized, they're secondary. We don't get to know them as much, or the film leaves and they're still in their kind of same situation while the white protagonist has really evolved or learned and grown through that experience. And that first and foremost starts with the point of view. When we think about the film Glory, or even more recently, we think about the film The Help, The Blind Side, we think about Hidden Figures, and this year, Green Book. Every one of those films was directed by a white director, male director. Every one of those films were written by a white male screenwriter. In two cases, with The Help and with Hidden Figures, there was a co-writer of a woman. So we'll give them credit in that regard. But when we're talking about culture, when we're talking about other ethnicities and races, to have a white male do primarily all of the writing and directing really can seem problematic, and in some ways be outright dismissive and prejudicial and maybe unintentional or intentionally racist. And yet these films do really well. Both The Help The Blind Side, Hidden Figures, and now Green Book, they all were commercial success, and they all got a lot of Oscar and awards buzz. Why is that? Well, one of the biggest problems about white savior films is that oftentimes they make racism digestible to the average white filmgoer. And so, because what it does is it highlights inequity, it highlights prejudice, but in a very safe after-school special sort of way that makes it safe for an average white American moviegoer to be able to say, yeah, racism is bad, and yeah, we should do something about it, and here's one person that does something about it, and they feel better about it. And you walk out of the movie with sort of a high redemptive climax of the film that in a lot of ways is not earned. It's been whitewashed, it's been sanitized. Because a lot of films that really explore the dark and often real horrors of racism and prejudice, those movies don't seem to do as well commercially. People don't want to watch that. People don't want to be reminded of how ugly and pervasive systematic prejudice and racism is. But what are the other problems about white savior tropes? Well, we already talked about the point of view. Let's also talk a little bit about it tends to centralize a white character. And it normalizes white characters having agency, autonomy, helping others, and growing. There's nothing wrong about any of those, but if it's at the expense of the characters that they are helping, or if it reinforces this notion that marginalized characters or people of color, they don't have agency and they can't help themselves, that's really dismissive and it's quite arrogant. And that really does sort of reinforce this idea of privilege or manifest destiny or even colonialism in the past, that white intellectual industrialized countries, it is their job to really redeem and lift up savage cultures, which oftentimes they were depicted as cultures of different ethnicities and racial background. And so this continues to reinforce that narrative, because in a lot of ways representation can leave an impression on moviegoers themselves. Now, oftentimes you don't see this in the film. In the film, the characters in the story are trying to be noble and show an element of moral decency and standing up to racism. But especially when you're dealing with real life characters, to accentuate the white protagonist over the black protagonist is really problematic in a lot of ways. Or when you feel like you have to do something that elevates a white character. Now, in the film Hidden Figures, there is a pretty prominent scene where the Kevin Costner character basically banishes the idea of separate bathrooms for folks of color. But in real life, this never took place. And the writer-director is quoted as saying, well, I had to add that because I had to show a white person doing the right thing. Which is completely, again, this idea of like, you have to centralize the white character experience at the expense of the plight and indignities that these real-life characters had. But here's my biggest problem with white savior films. And especially films that in a moment I'm going to talk about whether or not you can ultimately enjoy or like these films. My biggest complaint is that they reinforce a system. They reinforce the system where the lack of representation of women or writers of color or minority women, and directors. Because I just talked about how all these white savior films are pretty much written and directed by white men, even though they dive into the inequities, the injustice of minority culture and population. So with that, we know that Hollywood has a horrible track record of representation. And when you think about the number of screenwriters and writers, when you think about the number of directors, people of color or women is vastly underrepresented. It's great when representation takes place on the screen, but if it's at the expense of increasing the representation behind the screen, that's problematic. So when you have all these films about people of color, but they're written by white men, we need more women, we need more filmmakers and writers of color and women to create richly drawn out characters and stories. Because ultimately it's not just about representation, it's about profiteering. That means that all these films, the primary profiteers of it are white men. And to me, that is very problematic. Now, does that mean you can't enjoy a film like Glory or The Blind Side? The Blind Side, no, you really shouldn't enjoy a film like that because it's a really problematic film that even the main protagonist, Michael Orr, has gone out and said that they've taken his life story and made him a silent character in his own biography. So that movie really is problematic. But can you like a film that has some of these white savior tropes? Absolutely. There's a number of films, whether it be Glory, whether it be Hidden Figures, or Ryan Gosling's Half Nelson. I really enjoy both as films and cinematic experiences, but I don't think there's anything wrong with being able to acknowledge that they can be problematic at times, or outright they can be, whether it be problematic or offensive, or that they reinforce a really narrow-minded narrative or vision of black culture and minority cultures. I think it's okay to like something while acknowledging where it falls short. But hopefully we're gonna get more writers and filmmakers that can start to create great stories of real people and not have them just be secondary characters to a white protagonist as they grow and learn and evolve. Well, that's gonna do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. I really would be interested to hear your thoughts on the white savior cinematic trope. Where do you find that line between something well-intentioned, but ultimately they shoot themselves in their foot by the shortcomings or the people that create it? You can follow me on Twitter, and be sure to check out shrinktank.com, where you're gonna find other videos, articles, podcasts, and more that explore the intersection of pop culture and psychology. That's gonna do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again at the movies.